Well, my gracious, it's fun to be here this morning. I'm so glad for every smiling face I see out here. It's probably the greatest fear of a speaker is that no one will come. So you guys are really doing well. I want to mention that I had a birthday this past week. On Tuesday, it was either the 30th anniversary of my 43rd birthday or the 40th anniversary of my 33rd birthday. But I guess it doesn't matter because either way, I think I'm 73. And I have no idea how it happened so quick. My book contains a lot of the wisdom I've accumulated over those years, and we have a lot of new faces in our congregation since the last time I brought it in here and made it available. So if you're interested or at least curious, I'll be back there after the service. It would be a lovely birthday gift for me if you bought a copy. And you would receive a great book with an autograph from the author, so it would be like we both got a present for my birthday. So there you have it. That's the end of the commercial. So let's get on with the consciousness of freedom. I want to start by looking at David Hawkins' scale of consciousness. You can see that it's, can you guys see that okay, or do I need to turn the lights on?
You're okay here. Right down across.
Oh, that's much better. That's much better. Hawkins' scale of consciousness has kind of a watershed in the middle there, that dark line across just under 200. Below that line, the consciousness of people, bless their hearts, that carry those low levels of consciousness, which is the majority of mankind. Those people, bless their hearts, are actually kind of draining positive energy out of the vibration of our planet. Above 200, those levels actually add positive energy to the vibration of our planet. This is a logarithmic scale, which means that the level 201 is 10 times level 200. So when you look at an avatar level like 1000, where the Christ or Buddha might have been, they can actually overbalance or balance all the negative energy of the whole planet just by their own. Well, most of us, I'm pretty sure none of us are at 1000. So most of us are somewhere in the upper half, and our contribution is what keeps the planet moving, keeps it healthy. So anyway, let's look at the concept of freedom through this scale of consciousness. You don't see the word freedom up there. And I think it's because freedom has a different level of consciousness depending on who it is that's considering freedom and what it means. For instance, below 175, below pride, down into anger, grief, apathy, despair, regret, anxiety, disappointing, frightening, all of those kinds of ways that those people that are there, bless their hearts, experience life, they have no concept of freedom at all. They have no experience of it. It's just a word that basically has no meaning for them, okay? Now, by the time you get at 175, a little sense of some sort of freedom begins to creep into their awareness. Well, what it looks like is they're demanding of other people. They actually look down on everyone. They sort of scorn them, think they're dirtbags and useless. So they find a sense of kind of rudimentary freedom by pushing everything else down so they can feel taller. And that gives them some sense of who they are. So that is what freedom is like at that level. By the time you get to 200, the level of courage, freedom looks like power. You need to have economic and military power over those around you or nations around you in order to feel free. That's where your freedom is anchored. Slogans like freedom through strength, that were once carried by a local aerospace company kind of reflect that level of consciousness. So it looks like military power is kind of a key. And I think our history demonstrates that level for much of its activity. As you get above 200, the consciousness of freedom gets more benign. Cooperation, consideration, working together to accomplish things that give us all a sense of freedom begins to creep more and more into the perspective about freedom as you move up the scale above 200. So what might freedom look like at high levels of consciousness? The science of mind philosophy is all about using the natural laws that are the foundation of creation in ways that bring each of us the experience of spiritual freedom, which then can outpicture in the experiences of our daily lives, the physical, day-by-day moving through life that we all experience. So I'm going to read you a quote from Ernest Holmes about that. And the quote is longer than what I put on the screen. To suppose that the creative intelligence of the universe would create man or woman in bondage and leave him or her bound would be to dishonor the creative energy, the creative power, which we call God. To suppose that God could make man or woman as an individual without leaving him or her to discover him or herself would be to suppose an impossibility, because individuality must be spontaneous. It can never be automatic, or it isn't individuality. The seed of freedom must be planted in the innermost being of every human. But like the prodigal son, each person must make the discovery for him or herself. The divine plan is one of freedom. Bondage is not God ordained. Freedom is the birthright of every soul. All instinctively feel this. One more slide, please, slide 4. The truth points to freedom under law. Thus, the inherent nature of humanity is forever seeking to express itself in terms of freedom. It's probably easy for most of us to resonate with Ernest's statement because it's anchored in reason. It's anchored in science. It's anchored in logic. And in fact, this particular statement of Ernest calibrates in the very high 400s, just beneath the level of love, which was 500 on that chart. And the reason why is because it's anchored in logic. It's not anchored in love. Love is talked about a lot in the Science of Mind textbook, but Ernest's understanding as he developed it is anchored in the very high 400s. So at 500 on Hawkins' scale, concerns about freedom begin to fade into the background. Freedom becomes part of the normal context for your life. A good example is the Dalai Lama. He calibrates well above 500, right around 540, which Hawkins describes as unconditional love. That's about where he is. How he is as a person is, his freedom is just part of who he is. Just part of who he is. He can look at the Chinese people that have ravished the country of Tibet, forced him into exile decades ago. No matter what they seem to do to his country or to his people, he can look at them and say, I'm going to love you anyway, because you can't take away my freedom, because my freedom and love is who I am. It's part of who I am. So that's what freedom kind of fades into as you get above 500. I think you've probably heard this before in the last couple of weeks somewhere, but I want to read a little bit from the Declaration of Independence. 239 years and 8 days ago from this day, the United States of America was born, when the founding fathers issued our Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them together, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And then the next slide. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form, as to them shall seem most likely to affect, that is, to result in, their safety and happiness. The Declaration of Independence is anchored in oneness, and it calibrates at 700. It's the highest consciousness that the idea of freedom can even hold. Above 700, freedom is just absorbed into the ultimate experience of oneness. With oneness, there is nothing to be free from and nothing to move toward. One simply is. So that's kind of how the Declaration of Independence describes freedom, and how freedom sort of shifts in meaning and experience as people, depending on where they are on that scale of consciousness. In our culture, the Declaration of Independence has justifiably been placed on a pedestal. It's a remarkable document, far ahead of its time in its lofty ideals and eloquent language. But history has revealed that since the Revolutionary War finally actually secured our freedom, our independence as a nation, that the implementation of this beautiful document wasn't so perfect. In fact, if we use the societal norms of the 21st century, our time, the document was incomplete. Incomplete. It was exclusive rather than inclusive. Its provisions did not include women, Native Americans, African Americans, or any people of color. The ideas and words to express the rights and concerns for our lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender friends weren't even in the consciousness of humanity in 1776, so no wonder they were unconsciously omitted from the document. Even the Bill of Rights, enacted a few years later, including the right to vote, only applied to white men who owned property. Slavery was the elephant in the room that was ignored by the Founding Fathers. It was intentional because they knew that that issue would tear the independence movement to pieces before it ever got off the ground. So they chose to just set that aside. It was as if African Americans were somewhere less than human and would be just put over there for now. We ended up with a horrific civil war 84 years later to sort out the issue of slavery. And I don't really blame them for that choice, because had they made the choice to address slavery, I think we'd still be floundering around and saluting Queen Elizabeth today. So it was necessary. It was necessary. If we think about it, our founding fathers were the educated and economically elite men of the 13 colonies. In their collective wisdom, given their context, given their circumstances, They absolutely did the best they could, and it was almost miraculous, the level of consciousness that came through into that document. But perhaps there was a certain fear that opening a door of participation in government too wide could result in chaos and, I don't know what, ineffectiveness, confusion in the halls of government, perhaps even open the door to anarchy. Or maybe their thinking was simply shaped by the social norms of their time and tragically truncated by their choice to set slavery aside at that time. So as we celebrate our nation's freedom, it's important to notice that we, the people, have been engaged in the struggle to establish equal freedom for all our citizens to this day, and work still remains to be done. The key point of what I'm saying is this: freedom doesn't seem to be something that can be injected into a society by a document or into an individual by an intention. It seems always to be true that freedom is a process more than an event for a nation or an individual. So after all that, what does freedom mean to you? Are you focused on constraints you wish to be free from? Or are you seeking freedom to move into wholeness and a greater expression and fullness in the way your life moves through you? Okay? I think there's a difference between those two. If you're focused on being free from, you're kind of being held back. If you focus on moving toward, you're moving into freedom. I guess the bottom line question is freedom determined by our circumstances or by our consciousness? Let's consider an ultimate horror. If you can, just imagine yourself as a Jew in a Nazi concentration camp. How could anyone find any sense of freedom, even the ability to care for another person in the midst of that deep horror and fear? Actually, two men became very well known and famous as a result of that experience, how they responded to that experience. One of them was Viktor Frankl. He lived to be 92. He died in 1997. He was sent to Auschwitz at 37 years old. He was already a mature man and a world-famous psychiatrist, I think is the right word. Yes, neurologist and psychiatrist. He survived 3 years in hell on earth by finding meaning in that situation. He applied his considerable skills to help his fellow prisoners find the strength and courage to persevere in the face of absolute horror and fear. Afterwards, after they were liberated, he wrote a remarkable book entitled Man's Search for Meaning. And the essence of his philosophy is anchored in our power of choice, actually his power of choice at that moment. On slide 10, we see, and there's a little more to the quote than what shows, "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last crust of bread. There may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." And another quote, which I've seen cast in many different ways in various New Thought books, is this: "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. So despite the odds, Frankl remarkably managed to rise above the horrific circumstances he experienced and find meaning and some sense of freedom within his concentration camp years. The other is maybe even more famous than Viktor Frankl. It's Elie Wiesel. Was born in 1928 in the mountains of what is now Romania. He's now an American citizen, lives in Washington, D.C. He'll be 87 this coming September 30th. He was not nearly as well equipped to handle that experience as Viktor Frankl. In fact, few people were. Wiesel and his entire family were sent to camp when he was just 14. Quite a different sense of sending your 14-year-old to camp than we are having as a congregation right now. He alone survived. He wrote a very famous book called Night, which is about that experience. I just reread it in preparation for this. It was horrifying. It was terrifying. It literally made me so demoralized and depressed I can't hardly express it. I had nightmares for 2 hours after I went to sleep the night after I read it. And they were horrific. I won't even try to describe them. But that's, wow, what power there is in that book. It's something everybody ought to read and then read it in the morning so you don't have to go right to bed afterwards. There are some quotes from him which I want to share. There may be a time, I want to say first, he didn't speak about his experience for a decade once he was liberated. He was liberated when he was still in his mid-teens. He had watched his father die days before the liberation. It devastated him. It took him 10 years to process his experience before he spoke about it. And then he became one of the powerful people of the 20th century and beyond, speaking on behalf of oppressed people everywhere. One of his famous quotes is, "There may be a time when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest." His message is clear. Don't allow fear to make you silent. Another one that gives you a little more insight into him. "I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the oppressed. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." And then I think he came to believe that his and millions of his fellow Jewish people went through the Holocaust pretty much because of the indifference of the world. Somehow we weren't aware of it in some sense, but he equates that to indifference and lack of response to that horror. So he came up with this. The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. Elie Wiesel won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1986 for his life work as a writer, professor, and activist. Somehow both Wiesel and Frankl became inspiring examples of people who, within the most awful circumstances, were able to allow somehow their suffering to bring through them powerful energies in support of love and freedom and service. So our theme for the month of July is intentional freedom. So what is the role of intention in creating our experience of freedom? The best examples I have to talk about, and this is just the way it is, are from my own personal experience of life. 15 and a half years ago now, I retired from my career. my career was done. And I was determined to avoid the death trap of having a life with no meaning all of a sudden. I had seen two of my favorite bosses, two wonderful leaders who thought their life was their career was their life. They were both dead and gone within 3 years after retirement. And I could see what had happened to them, and that was not going to be my story. So, when I retired, and some of you may have heard this before, my intention was expressed, and I wasn't even thinking about it as an intention in those years, was I am going to dedicate my retirement to reinventing Foster. And that's evolved. You know, when I first started, I thought it would be a 2-year project, like all those engineering projects I used to do. It would be well organized, well implemented, and 2 years later I would be reinvented. Not so much. In truth, how it's evolved is into a kind of a lifelong process. It just keeps unfolding. So that simple declaration that I didn't even think of as an intention has shaped my entire life since I retired in year 2000. There seems to be no end in sight to this unfolding. I would like you to show the sunset picture. There we go. I want to share a recent experience that sort of illustrates this ongoing unfolding. It's reached a point where I have, I don't know what I would call them, numinous experiences, connections with aspects of creation that surprise me and seem beyond our daily life. Anyway, just over a week ago, in the midst of writing this, I just had this itch. I just had to get up and go outside. And I remember saying to myself as I saved the document and closed the computer and walked out, there was a beautiful sunset happening out in back of our house at the time. And I said to myself, I've got to feel the earth. I almost felt desperate. I don't know what I even meant. Feel the earth. What is that? So a beautiful sunset was already happening. It was gorgeous. You've all seen them. I don't need to describe it in much detail. It was cold. We had a south-blowing wind, but it was chilly, and I was wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and all of a sudden I was cold, so I wrapped up my bald head and my bare legs in a blankie, and to hold the wind at bay, and went outside and sat for quite some time watching the sunset. There was a message there that I needed to somehow feel inside. Since a wilderness rafting trip that Marilyn and I took 20 years ago down the Tatshenshini and Alsek rivers that end up in southeast Alaska, I had thought the perfect kind of closing moment for my earthly life would be my children would somehow be scattering my ashes over the headwaters of the Tatshenshini, and I would become part of that magnificent wilderness ecosystem in some sense. So it just sort of been stuck in my head ever since. That's what I want to do. I've told Marilyn this. And I got a new plan during this sunset. The sunset was striking with its patterns of cloud shapes, glowing and glorious shades of magenta, peach, and red. There was a small, really dark cloud, not very big in area, but really intensely dark, that was sort of right in the middle of that sunset. And somehow it became a symbol of my death. It was kind of upsetting for a bit, but then it sort of thinned out and dissipated enough so it didn't seem so important. There was a message in that little vignette right there, and it's this: I am not a creature of that darkness. I was born to soar as a creature of light. And death has no power over that light that I am. It didn't stop there. Then in my mind's eye, I beheld a scene at the top of Mount Evans. It's kind of the centerpiece of our view, and it's become a symbol the last few years since we've lived out here of my connection with, my anchoring in nature and the mountains and life, Mother Earth. My daughters and their children, I don't know where you were, but my daughters and their children were there on top of Mount Evans, facing northwest toward the sunset. And the wind was blowing a cool south breeze, just like it was the night that I was having this experience. And they were emptying the container of my ashes. They just blew away into that wild heart of light that's the very center of who Mother Earth is, and the very center of who I am. In addition to all that, there was a golden eagle silhouetted against that sunset, soaring around and screaming its wild call of freedom to let my descendants know that all was well with my soul. I just sat for a moment, kind of overwhelmed. The message is, we don't have to wait for death to be free. We are free today, right now. We're free to dream the life we wish to lead. And we are free to move into the direction of our dreams. Knowing freedom isn't mysterious or complicated. Freedom is ours right now, right this minute, right in this place, to the degree that we believe in it and claim it. Now, claiming our freedom usually requires us to take action. I don't know anybody who found their freedom by sitting in front of a TV set and hoping the UPS guy would come along soon and bring it. It just doesn't work that way. So we've got to do it. We've got to start. This is the moment. It's a perfect moment to begin. So take that first step. Take a class that you've been attracted to and been putting off. If you've been inspired to be dabbling in paints and oils and canvases, do that. If you lack inspiration, life is always just thriving all around us. So take a walk in nature and allow the beauty of creation to inspire you, to wake you up. Please, let's close our eyes. Take a deep breath. Look within to the very center of your being. Take the time to get in touch with yourself. Look inside and ask yourself, what is my sense of freedom? How do I feel about freedom? What do I believe about my freedom? Remember, we are as free as we believe ourselves to be. Our experience of freedom is truly determined by our conscious belief. This means, on the last slide, we have the capacity within us right now to create the freedom of our dreams. Let us pray. As we rest here for a moment in the very presence of the divine wholeness, the all, the energy that resulted in the entire cosmos, including you and me, and all that beautiful expression of nature that's all around us, especially in this beautiful setting of Colorado. We know that freedom is innate within us. We were born with it. And it's just waiting to express itself through each of us in ways that are beyond our imagination. So as we now choose to move into that sense of freedom, to take the steps to do whatever we are called to do, to become whoever we are called to be, that now opens within our hearts, within our minds, within our activities as we take action to invite freedom to express more fully through each of us. So we now just anchor ourselves in that knowing of freedom. We commit ourselves to move in that direction. No matter how free we felt when we walked through the door this morning, we can walk out knowing there is even more freedom available and that it is ours for the claiming. So we give thanks for that truth. We just allow it to move as we give thanks and as we release this prayer, knowing that it is already set in motion, the very freedom that we have spoken about. And so we give thanks and we affirm this truth by saying together, and so it is.